Welcome back, everybody. I'm Kiely, the Lee Hills Chair in Free Press Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. I'd like to set the stage for this year's Friends of the Facts conference with a little history, personal history. I'm here to give you an overview of the information revolution that I have lived as a news reporter and editor. On our walk through recent history, I'll be pointing out some highlights and lowlights and key turning points. Yes, that's me, around 1979 or 1980. Notice the technology, if you want to call it that. The notebook you see in my hand was the only equipment I needed when I went out on a story, unless you count the dimes for the payphone. I had to find one of those so I could call the desk, as we used to say. The rewrite desk was a stable of veteran journalists who could polish the greenest reporter's notes into professional copy. From there, it would be edited and proofread, and then the words on paper would go to a press room where they were retyped by linotypists and cast in hot lead to be set upside down and backwards onto a plate that would become a page of the next day's newspaper. It would be printed and paginated and folded on gigantic, complicated machines, and then loaded on trucks for delivery to newsstands and front porches. It was what a lot of people now sentimentalize as the golden age of news. Just about every town of any size had more than one newspaper. In the evenings, everyone watched national news on TV at the same time on one of 3 broadcast networks. CBS anchorman Walter Cronkite was said to be the most trusted man in America. Well, don't let the nostalgia fool you. There was a lot to dislike about the old system. The fact that you had to employ all those people and own all that equipment, not to mention the large buildings needed to house them, that meant only rich people could afford to be publishers. They were mostly white and mostly male. And guess what? They tended to hire and promote people who looked like them to cover what they thought was news. Still, there's one thing to be said for owning all that equipment and real estate. It is a lot to lose in a libel suit. So there was, and still is for those who work for legacy news outlets, a real financial incentive to check and double check for accuracy. Keep that point in mind. We'll be coming back to it, because even as I was starting my journalism career, some of the old ways were coming to an end. Looking back, I see it as 3 big waves that swelled simultaneously over the last few decades and now have come crashing together. First and foremost, the digital revolution and the way it has democratized the means of publication. That has provided more diversity in our news coverage, but it has also empowered propagandists, charlatans, and racists. Second, there's been a gradual conflation of news and entertainment. That's given rise to what some term the distraction economy, which privileges the outrageous, even the mendacious, over sober facts. Third and last is the atomization of the audience. We don't sit down at the same time and watch the same things anymore. Along with that, there's been a proliferation of digital tools that separate us even further. They allow us to be labeled and pigeonholed by our perceived opinions and habits, and spoon-fed not only advertising, but news, designed to appeal to the stereotypes marketers have of us. Another important thing to keep in mind as a result of the changes I've just outlined. You may feel as if you have more media in your life than ever, and you do, but there are fewer professionals producing it. According to the respected Pew Research Center, American newsrooms lost nearly 1/4 of their employees over the past 12 years. So how did all this change come about? Let's start with the digital revolution. About the time I started working as a reporter, newspapers were making a big technological shift. The last day of linotype and hot lead in the newsroom of the New York Times came in 1978.
We are fast approaching press time for the first edition of tomorrow morning's paper. This printer has just finished makeup of a page. In the next 56 minutes, all pages must be finished and recorded to meet the edition deadline of 9 p.m. But tonight's deadline is special. This New York Times mirror image in lead of tomorrow's dateline reads backwards as Sunday, July 2nd, 1978. It marks the last day of an age-old method of printing in this composing room. What you are now witnessing will exist after tonight only as a filmed historic record, for the century of the linotype machine is nearing its end.
By 1980, a few newspapers were beginning to experiment with electronic delivery.
Imagine, if you will, sitting down to your morning coffee, turning on your home computer to read the day's newspaper. Well, it's not as far-fetched as it may seem. In fact, both local San Francisco papers are investing a lot of money to try and get a service just like that started. Science editor Steve Newman reports on one person already using the brand new system.
17 stories up in his fashionable North Beach apartment, Richard Halloran is calling a local number that will connect him with a computer in Columbus, Ohio. Meanwhile, across town, in this less than fashionable cubbyhole at the San Francisco Examiner, these editors are programming today's copy of the paper into that same Ohio computer. When the telephone connection between these two terminals is made, the newest form of electronic journalism lights up Mr. Halloran's television with just about everything the Examiner prints in its regular edition. That is, with the exception of pictures, ads, and the comics.
In 1984, Steve Jobs bought time during the Super Bowl to run an ad announcing a new kind of personal computer that he touted as the antidote to groupthink.
Of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts. Our unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people. One will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
That ad is iconic, and now pretty ironic, given what has happened since. Key turning point alert. The change that would really jumpstart the communications revolution came a few years later, in 1991, at CERN, a nuclear research center in Switzerland. It had nothing to do with fission. The center merely opened to the public something that its leaders had initially dismissed as a vague but exciting idea from one of its scientists. Tim Berners-Lee was looking for a faster, more efficient way for his colleagues across the globe to share all the work they had on their computers. His vague but exciting idea turned out to be the World Wide Web. Within a few years, eager grad students at the University of Illinois and Stanford were building internet search engines that featured graphical user interfaces. GUIs, as they are called after their acronym, turn indecipherable lines of green code on a screen into the intuitive point-and-click technology that has made computing accessible to everyone. At this point, the internet was starting to get the attention of policymakers. Which brings us to another key moment, the significance of which was unknown and unappreciated at the time. In 1996, then President Bill Clinton signed a new Telecommunications Act into law. Section 230 gave important new protections to a fledgling industry. It exempted internet platform providers from libel suits. Today, we are grappling with the fallout of that well-intentioned decision made when Google was in its infancy and Mark Zuckerberg was 12. Facebook wouldn't arrive on the scene for 8 years. Sensing the promise of the internet, members of Congress were trying to protect what were essentially First Amendment garage bands at the time from onerous legal fees that they probably could not have afforded then. But in the process, they created a double standard. If you defame me in a letter to the editor and the newspaper prints it, I can sue the paper. If you post the same thing on Facebook, I can't sue Facebook. So unlike the old-fashioned publishers I used to work for, who still have to worry about losing their buildings and trucks and printing presses, online platforms don't have much incentive to police their content. In the view of Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa, a journalist, that has made them vectors of hate that are biased against facts. It's hard to remember now that in the late 1990s, when Congress created that libel exemption, what came to be called social media, a giant, was still in its promising infancy. Blogging software had just been introduced, empowering a tech-savvy class of citizen journalists who sometimes scooped the better-paid, better-credentialed kind. But you still needed to have a certain comfort level with computer software to be a blogger. That would change in 2004, when Mark Zuckerberg, now a Harvard student, unveiled the Facebook. Social media made publishing easy for amateurs.
And this is what it looks like.
And 3 years later, in 2007, Apple's Steve Jobs made it possible for everyone to distribute their content when he introduced the iPhone. Soon, we'd all have computers in our pocket, giving us all access to the global stream of consciousness that is the internet. And we get access to all that information instantly. That's another big change. We need to understand the implications of instant information if we want to be news literate. A newspaper or an evening newscast is the product of a 24-hour news cycle. At the end of it, editors review everything that has happened and make professional judgments about which stories deserve the audience's attention. What's the lead story? What's the off-lead? Which stories are important enough to get the biggest headlines or photos or the most time on the newscast? Those standard newsroom operating procedures started to change in a big way in 1980, the year Ted Turner launched America's first round-the-clock TV news channel. CNN, like all the imitators and websites to come later, had a commercial imperative to keep viewers coming back. So in the 24/7 news cycle, the lead isn't necessarily the most important story. It's what's new and what's now. And an awful lot of incremental news becomes breathless and breaking. And an awful lot of us become addicted. Exhibit A. In 1994, 95 million viewers watched a slow-motion car chase live on TV as cops tried to convince former football star O.J. Simpson to turn himself in on murder charges. The O.J. case was a sad and sordid story of infidelity and murder that people tried to overhype into some sort of cultural Rosetta Stone to justify the salacious wall-to-wall coverage. The O.J. case is an example of the second big change that I've witnessed over the course of my career in the news business: the blurring of lines between news and entertainment. This also has been a long time coming. When I was a kid in the 1960s, we had a president and first lady, Jack and Jacqueline Kennedy, who captivated the country with their Hollywood lifestyle. In 1980, Ronald Reagan, an actual Hollywood star, became President of the United States. Now, Reagan did so after making a transition into politics. He served as a union leader and conservative activist, and then won election as California's governor before moving on to the White House. But in 1998, Jesse "the Body" Ventura went straight from the World Wrestling Federation to governor of Minnesota. The following year, comedian Jon Stewart took over as host of Comedy Central's The Daily Show, becoming a merry prankster version of Walter Cronkite. To Stewart's dismay, many younger viewers came to rely on the satirist for news. At the end of that same year, 1999, a New York tabloid personality named Donald Trump launched his first exploratory bid for the presidency as a candidate for Jesse Ventura's Reform Party. Arnold Schwarzenegger went straight from the set of The Terminator to the California governor's mansion in 2003. The following year, Donald Trump began a star-turned barking, "You're fired," on the TV series The Apprentice. It ran for 15 seasons, after which Trump went from reality TV to real commander-in-chief. With so many entertainers elbowing their way into politics, is it any wonder that politicians have started to behave like entertainers? If you're too serious, or if the issue you're talking about is too disturbing, it's all too easy for your audience to just click away. Which brings me to the last big change in the news ecosystem, the atomization of the audience. This phenomenon also started with cable TV in what seemed like a harmlessly nerdy way. In March 1979, C-SPAN put the proceedings of the House of Representatives on TV for the first time, giving political junkies a channel of their own. This was quickly followed, a few months later, by the launch of ESPN.
If you're a fan, what you'll see in the next minutes, hours, and days to follow may convince you you've gone to sports heaven. Beyond that blue horizon is a limitless world of sports, and right now you're standing on the edge of tomorrow. Sports, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with ESPN, the Total Sports Cable Network.
In 1996, Rupert Murdoch upped the ante, announcing the creation of Fox News. With that, it became possible to tailor your media consumption not only according to your interests, news, sports, a certain kind of sports, or weather, but by your politics. Fox's commercial success would eventually influence other cable channels, and some might argue all news outlets, to respond in kind, switching from a neutral tone to one aligned with a particular audience's point of view. The Internet put this phenomenon on steroids. Internet platform providers can tabulate every click and every like we make online. They know how much time we spend looking at a page before we click over to something else, and what that something else might be. All that provides them with information that helps them make money by keeping us on their sites.
So when I was growing up
in 2011, as Facebook's worldwide user base approached 1 billion, Internet activist Eli Pariser delivered a TED Talk that introduced a new concept into our lexicon, the filter bubble. Pariser, a liberal who enjoyed debating his conservative friends online, one day noticed there were fewer and fewer of them on his Facebook feed. Trying to figure out why led him to discover that algorithms, the same that serve up advertisements for the shoes you've been looking for online or the vacation you've been researching, those algorithms also were editing his news feed to serve up only views Eli might like. For the vulnerable, this can become a form of brainwashing. After the 2016 presidential campaign, a man who had been fed a steady diet of Internet rumors showed up one Sunday afternoon at a neighborhood pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. He had military-grade weaponry. He was on a mission to save non-existent child victims of a mythical kiddie porn ring. I guess I had bad intel, Edgar Madison Welch told the police who arrested him. Luckily, there was only one life disrupted in that episode, Welch's. He ended up spending almost 4 years in jail. Weekend shoppers at a Buffalo grocery store in May weren't so lucky. We know the shooter who killed 10 people there also had his paranoia and psychosis fed by online communities of racist hate. So, to recap, this is not your grandfather's news media, or even your father's, or even the news media I grew up with, and we can't read it or watch it or listen to it as if it were. Number one, for better or for worse, the news media has been democratized. You don't need to be a member of a moneyed elite to publish. That's good when it means a greater diversity of voices. Not so good when it opens the door for untrustworthy actors. Number two, news and entertainment have become increasingly intertwined to a point where it's sometimes hard for consumers to distinguish one from the other. Satire is sometimes mistaken for news, and news figures sometimes mistake themselves for entertainers. Number three, the audience is more segmented than ever. Increasingly sophisticated marketing techniques not only affect what ads we are served, but the news that's recommended to us. The result is what I'd describe as the foxhole effect, where we're increasingly herded into categories or typologies. We receive only news from and by the like-minded, and never have our received opinions challenged. So how do we take advantage of all the choices the internet offers us without falling prey to charlatans, or curating our way into our own tunnel vision? How do we learn to recognize the news equivalent of empty calories and work some whole grains back into our information diet? That's what we're here to discuss this week. Spoiler alert, we're unlikely to answer all of these questions in our sessions. But we do hope that by raising your consciousness to the way media has changed, we can make you more aware of how to find reliable information and less susceptible to the other kind. And we hope to help you do the same for others in your circles. With any luck, this will turn out to be a super spreader event for a good kind of virus, one that will make us savvier users of the internet and better citizens of the digital world in which we all live. So thanks for taking time out of your schedule to be part of the conversation. Democracy depends on it.